Welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Nelson. On this podcast, we talk about all things to increase performance, increase muscle, improve body composition, do all of it within a flexible framework without destroying your health. Today, we've got Martin McPhilimey. He is a respiratory and sleep scientist, exercise physiologist. He is the founder of the School of Breath Science. He actually has 2 master's degree accredited through the UK National School of Healthcare Sciences. And what's super cool is he's working at the intersection of breathing, sleep, stress regulation, and human performance. And so I wanted to get him on the podcast to do a deep dive into all things breathing related because he has such a wide background, both academically and working with people in the real world, like actually coaching them, and he gets paid for results. So I like the combination of having a solid academic background in the mechanisms, but also having it validated by doing work in the real world. And this was, I would say it's a little bit in depth because we kind of started going super hard into the weeds pretty soon. But I will link to some of the other podcasts I've done on breathing also if you want a little bit more of a primer in that area. So I didn't really want to repeat a lot of the stuff that's been done before. And so we got into much more of the weeds and much more of the intricacies across a wide variety of topics related to breath. And if you really want to take another deep dive, the Physiologic Flexibility Certification is still open now through this coming Monday, April 27th, 2026 at midnight Pacific Standard Time. And if you want more info, we'll put a link down below there in the podcast. And we do, it's Pillar 4 that I talk about O2 and CO2 regulation. And so I was able to get it down to the technical lecture there. I think it's about 2.5 hours, which, oh boy, that took me a long time to be able to do that, considering I took whole physiology 5,000 level classes on just how your lungs are actually moving air in and out, much less all the other mechanisms. But we also break it down to make it super easy so you can also apply all of the information across temperature regulation, pH, and breathing and expanded fuels, all to help increase performance, make you more resilient, and allow you to be even more anti-fragile, just generally much harder to kill. And then if you're a trainer and you've done really good work with the basics of nutrition, sleep, and exercise, and you're still kind of can't figure out why clients are not progressing as much as they want, what I found over time is that it's probably one of these 4 areas is kind of the rate limiter. And a big one, which we do touch on here in this podcast, is CO2 regulation. So I think that part alone will be worth just listening to this podcast. And then in the course, we do a deep dive on it. So if you're interested in that, go to the link down below. If it is after the time the course is open, I think you can still get on the wait list for the next time it opens, which probably won't be until fall of this year. Again, if you have any questions, you can contact me. Make sure to check out all of Martin's great stuff over at the School of Breath Science and all the wonderful certs and everything else he does. We'll definitely put links to all of that down below. And like I said, I think you'll enjoy this podcast where we talk about the practical aspects of it and also a little bit more on the academic side. So enjoy this with Martin McPhilimey. To the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate it too, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and I've been following and spying on your stuff on Instagram for quite some time, and like we were saying before we hit record, it's super nice to see the depth of physiology that you have, but also trying to make it practical because, as you know, I think at a surface level, people are like, oh, breathwork, whatever, you breathe, it's easy. There's not much, really going on physiology-wise. And as you know, there's so much stuff that goes on. Like, I remember the first probably hardcore class I did on this was just a whole class on just respiratory breathing, just literally on how the lungs work. We weren't talking
Mm.
about anything else of the body, just how the lungs are set up, how you get air in, how you get air out, and that was like a whole freaking semester on that stuff, And granted, it was more geared towards medical students and people who would be doing ventilation and ventilators and stuff like that. But it was the first time where I kind of paused and went, "Oh, there's a lot more to this than I thought there was."
Yeah, it's because it's such a simple thing that we do and it's an unconscious thing we do. Every single day we're breathing to obviously stay alive, but we're not even really paying attention to it too much. People just assume that it's simple. Anyone could go and teach someone how to do breath work. Like you could just go, well, I've watched a video on that and I'm going to go
Yeah,
and teach them. But understanding what's actually happening, what's going on physiologically, and really like there's a lot of medical professionals say that respiratory physiology is one of the most challenging areas, as well as exercise physiology, and
it
obviously
is.
those two and metabolic physiology. All
Yep.
three of those things are all connected. You can't have metabolic physiology and exercise physiology without respiratory physiology, or vice versa.
Yep.
And so, that's where, for me, and it's just in general, it's like the breath is at the center of the mind-body connection, and it regulates every single system. And it has to be tightly regulated because of pH shifts. And if we go outside of those pH shifts, we spoil all metabolism. And it's not long until we get sick or die.
Yep. Yeah, I this was made more even apparent to me. I did a whole class on physiologic flexibility. And so
Mm.
pillar 4 was all CO2 and O2 regulation. And when I was setting it up, I thought, I'm taking all this stuff. This can't be really that hard. And then you realize, oh crap, I've been looking at this stuff for freaking 20 years, and now I have to teach it to someone who may not necessarily have anything past a really basic knowledge. And I first thought, I can get this into an hour. And then I was like, I can get this into 2 hours. Maybe I could get it into 3 hours that I had to redo like 4 times to
Mm.
just because you start and you're like, oh wait, but to know this, you have to know this. And then, oh wait, to know that, you have to know this. And to know that, you had to have known that. And so you end up going all the way back to the beginning. And like you said, that was not even the overlap into other systems and how they deal with it. But what kind of made you get into breathwork more from, obviously the practical side, but even just to want to go that deep into the physiology of it?
When I studied, so exercise physiology I did sports science degree at university, and exercise physiology was the major area that I studied. And when I was in my third year going to do my dissertation, we were doing some lung function tests in the lab as a practical assessment, and we were actually measuring the diaphragm strength, so looking at
Oh,
maximum
cool.
inspiratory pressures. I was very fortunate to have two respiratory professors in our lab, and I can remember going round in the lab, and a couple of my housemates, I was a rugby player, a couple of my housemates were also in the lab as well. They were rugby players, so we got a bit competitive to see who had the strongest diaphragm, as you can imagine,
Yep.
between two different athletes. And I just blew them out the water.
Hmm.
Generally, so the average, maximum respiratory pressure is between 120 and 150 centimeters of water. I hit like 220, then 250, and then like
Oh
260.
shit.
And so the professor was like, we've actually not really seen that high before. Would you be interested to come in the lab and do some more assessments? And so I
Hmm.
was like, yeah, of course. And so I then did it was almost like a bleep test for breathing, where they would basically set a rhythm to breathe at and then stack weights
Ah.
on top and build a resistance.
Oh, interesting.
It was in a vacuum seal, and it was a way to obviously measure then respiratory endurance. And I smashed the whole thing.
Hmm.
I got through the whole thing, and they were gobsmacked. They were like, we've never seen this before. And so you can imagine that made me very curious. It kind of probably inflated that part of my ego. And I was like, well, so then they asked me if I wanted to do a research project in that area. And so I did a master's of research the following year, where I then started to look at, can we use isocapnic hypnea as a way to improve shuttling of lactate
Hmm.
following high intensity exercise? Because the diaphragm is primarily type 1 muscle fibers. And so we got people on a bike. We got them to do 4 1-minute sprints as hard as possible with 30 seconds in between. Got lactate,
Oof.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, Wingate stuff.
right
Good
through the
times.
roof, Wingate route stuff. And then we did a 15-minute period following where we either got them just to breathe normally, or we got them to load with 15% resistance and then to hyperventilate through that whilst we were titrating CO2 and taking arterial blood gases at the same time and running them through venous blood gases, running them through a CO2 monitor to keep the CO2 level the same. So you can imagine that was a very fiddly
Yeah.
thing to do. And then we did 6 weeks of inspiratory muscle training and repeated the test again. And we found that post inspiratory muscle training, you could actually increase the shuttling of lactate from the system following high intensity exercise by using isocapnic hypernia.
Hmm.
And so as a master's degree, I'm doing CPET testing, I'm doing bloods, I had esophageal balloons in there
Oh,
in their
geez, you're going
in their
hardcore.
lungs to look at diaphragmatic pressures
Yep.
as well as inspiratory muscle training and all that sort of stuff. So I dived in a deep end straight away. And I wanted to become a sports scientist and work with people in obviously teams and stuff like that. But it's more about experience and knowing people than it is about having a
Yeah.
master's degree and walking into
Yeah.
those areas. I always think when you get a master's degree, it's like, oh, you're going to get a job now, but that's not how it was. So I actually then I applied for a training role that had started in the UK back in 2011, 2012, where they were trying to bring some academic scientists into the clinical space because they were noticing all the senior physiologists were being retiring and there wasn't many young
Mm.
people coming through. And so they did a national training program in the UK called the Scientist Training Program. And there was a role where you could train as a respiratory and sleep scientist in a clinical position. And it was a paid position. And it was like PhD or do that. And I wanted to make money
Yeah,
because
that's understandable.
so I decided to go down the route of getting a wage and getting trained as a clinical scientist whilst getting a salary and also did another MSc in clinical respiratory and sleep sciences and did that for 3 years. And so, yeah, I ended up working in hospitals and going down the clinical route and becoming a
Hmm.
clinical scientist for 10 years. And so that was all obviously, clinical medical work. But I moved to Australia. I'm from the UK originally. I moved to Australia in 2016 on my own. And I went from working in one of the biggest hospitals in London to a small little clinic in Western Australia. And so, as a scientist, probably made a poor decision because there was no research, there was no funding, there wasn't anything other than just seeing, patients. And the type of patients I was seeing changed, going from very, very sick people and working with, ventilators and people on death's door to unwell people who were not quite sure what's going on with their body. And that's what I recognized. And so after about 3 or 4 years of doing that, and then doctors going, your results are normal, go back to your GP, I felt as if there was a gap where I could help support with like the nervous system regulation, sleep, dysfunctional breathing, anxiety management from a physiological standpoint. And so I actually built, that was when my online business was around those three key areas. And that was around about 2018. And then obviously 2019, at the latter end of that, COVID hit, and the whole world was focusing on social media and online because they were locked down. The whole world was anxious. There was a breathing issue going on, being spread around the world at the same time. And
Yep.
breath work became popular. And so I would just happen to be in a very fortunate space where I had a good authority in that space. I started to put on free breathwork sessions online and educational sessions around stress management for people who were in lockdown. And it just started to work very well. So I actually decided to quit my clinical career and see whether I could build an online business. Left Australia, traveled through Asia, and managed to build a successful business online. And that turned into people asking me to mentor them in the
Hmm.
space because there wasn't any depth in science in the breathwork space.
Yeah.
So I kept getting DMs saying, "Hey, like, would you mentor me? Like, I'm not quite understanding this. I'd really love support." So I put like a six month training together, started mentoring people, and that's now 3 years later turned into a concept of School of Breath Science, which is an international kind of global online school where I've got 250, 300 students around the world, and a big community of practitioners. And so, just very fortunate timing, obviously a good history, and just lucky that breath became a popular thing in the wellness space.
Yeah, that's awesome. And were you kind of, and I'll go back to your study in just a bit because I want to know more about that, and we'll
Mm,
explain it for the listeners in English too.
mm.
But Were you kind of surprised that breathwork became popular? I mean, the first time it ever kind of showed up on my radar, like I had, looked at the academic stuff and then look at some of the, the yogi breathing and all these different type techniques have been around for a while. But I, my biased opinion is I think Wim Hof was kind of the first guy who really popularized it. And I
Mm.
remember being at a dinner, God, probably this is what, maybe 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago now. I won't say his name because it's a private conversation, but most people would know who he is. And we're having
Right.
dinner, and I'm asking him. I said, "Yeah, what do you think about breath work and this Wim Hof guy?" And his answer was, "I don't know. It seems pretty interesting, but he's kind of kooky." And I thought, like, oh, that's kind of the best description of it. But I think it took someone with a big personality and maybe being a little bit over
Mm.
the top to get
Mm.
everybody's attention. That, yeah, you know what, we should probably pay attention to this.
Yeah, I think again, it was a timing thing
Oh, for
where
sure.
people everyone was on social media or YouTube then because it's all you could do is sit at home and just twiddle your thumbs,
Yeah.
scrolling or watching TV. And if you didn't want to watch the news about what was happening as the virus was spreading, you would just be on social media going through your doomsday things. But I also think there's not just timing. I think that particular practice itself, the Wim Hof method, gave what people needed in that moment, which was to feel good.
Yes.
Yeah, because regardless, it's state change. And
Yeah,
so
for
it creates
100%.
creates
Very
dopamine,
fast too.
creates endogenous kind of like internal feelings that make you feel like, oh, I feel good. And so when the whole world is feeling down, you have this practice that comes in that you can do at home that's free that also does have this kind of like really crazy kind of personality behind it that whilst yeah he might be kooky also some people might love because they're like okay this character's funny to kind of follow. I think it's a combination of that,
Hmm.
those two things really. And yeah, he has brought that to the forefront. And obviously then you had Andrew Huberman release his podcast, and I
Yeah.
believe his first three podcasts were on sleep, stress, and then nervous system and then breathing,
Yep.
something like that. And so for me, I was just like, well, this podcast got massive, and I'm also in that space. That also pulled me in, and obviously, and Wim Hof pulled me in as well. And then obviously the likes of Patrick McEwen, who's Denoxian Advantage, and
Yep.
I think it's just everyone just kind of just raised awareness together, really. And of course, Brian McKenzie and the crew that over there as well, HHP Foundation. So I do feel there was kind of some leaders that started to show up more, speak louder, that kind of pushed it. And then you've got James Nestor releasing his book at that time.
Oh, that was so huge. That was just like and I had him on my podcast early on, and he was great, but that was just like if you could time anything perfect, and as you know, putting out content and stuff, like the amount of back work it takes to get content out in a book
Mm,
and stuff like that. It's not something you snap your fingers and shows up in a week, but
no.
I think the timing of that was just like dead on.
Well, how can and how much more can you time a book related to breath when there's a respiratory virus that's
Yeah.
making the world panic? Yeah, and so I'm just sat here with gratitude for all those people as well as yeah, I feel like I actually the reason why I put on so many free breathwork sessions and educational sessions online was because I felt I was one of the persons that was benefiting from a situation where the whole world was not benefiting from. And so I
Yeah,
was like,
and
I wanted to give back.
which I think is great. And you also then realize when you go that far down, like how profound you can get changes. And like what you were saying with the
Mm,
Wim Hof stuff, like it was the first time I think anyone did breath work where they felt a difference within the first few minutes. I
mm,
feel like a lot of the breath work before that point was, okay, let's go relax and let's do Zen style meditation and go stare at a tree and all. I love all that stuff. I think it's great.
mm.
But I've noticed in practice, it was so hard to get anyone to do it, myself included. Where now
Yeah.
you got this crazy guy who's like, yeah, just hyperventilate for a little bit. And you're like, oh my God, I feel better already. Oh my God, there's something to this thing.
Yeah, that's it. It captures people, right? And that all those styles of breath work do capture people. Now, I'd argue that they're not right for everybody.
Oh, I
Uh,
100% agree with
Um,
that.
certainly needs to be some assessing beforehand, and
Oh,
also
yeah.
some contraindications to doing that sort of work. And obviously there's times and places, as with all physiological changes, and context always matters.
Yep.
But at that time, I think that was irrelevant, to be honest with you, the context, because everyone probably needed some form of coping mechanism.
Yeah. So we'll talk about contraindications and the Wim Hof stuff, and then I'll go back and ask you about your study. I don't know if you've noticed this, but one of the things I noticed with the Wim Hof stuff was that when it was becoming real popular, I still remember I had one client who was doing CrossFit, and we could not, I was beating my head against the wall. We could not figure out why her HRV just collapsed, her stress went off the roof. We're going through nutrition, her sleep. We looked at blood work, we looked at everything, and I'm like, I've looked at enough HRV to know that there's a real change. Like there's something going on. And then you start thinking, oh my God, does she have a cancer? Do we need to send her to another doctor? You know, what else do we need to do? And finally she said, oh yeah, well, I started doing this 20 minutes of Wim Hof and cold water immersion first thing in the morning. I'm like, when did you start that? It's like, oh, about 2 weeks ago. And like you look at her scores and they just went off the cliff.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, how hard are you doing this? She's like, well, I do about 10 minutes of Wim Hof as hard as I can. And then, I get into 38-degree water for like 3 minutes. And I'm like, oh, yeah, those are both like high sympathetic stressors on top of a system that you're doing a lot of sympathetic stress
Mhm.
already. Like that'll definitely cause what's going on. And she's like, oh, really? And I started seeing more clients very similar, but not to the degree of that. So one,
Mm.
would you agree that that is kind of more on, if this is a generalization, the sympathetic style of breathing, and when would you use that for some clients versus not use it for other clients?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I actually, I created a post not long ago that was saying that the breathwork style matters less than the overall allostatic load in the system.
For sure. And
And
explain
so,
allostatic load for people, that might be a new term.
yeah, so that's the accumulation of stresses in your life, you
Yep.
could really say. Biopsychosocial stresses, you could even put spiritual stresses in there if you wanted to
Sure.
as well. But anything that has an impact on physiology, it accumulates. And there's only a certain capacity that people have within their nervous system, whether their muscular system, whether that's the brain, whether it's the cells, mitochondria, all of it needs to be considered. And so if we have someone who is doing CrossFit, who is drinking a lot of caffeine, who's also at home having financial issues as well. And then all of a sudden they go, well, I've heard this Wim Hof method or this practice here or ice baths are good. Well, it's not good or bad. It's context relevant according to
Yeah.
the situation. Right? And so then we add that cold on top and we add that sympathetic kind of like increase in breathing practice on top. And we might have just tipped them over the edge of how much allostatic load capacity they have, and then we start to see a decline in HRV, and it can't rebound. Now that's okay if that happens for 4 or 5 weeks. They take a rest and it rebounds straight back up again.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Just like
then you've got
exercise.
you've got the adaptation,
Yep.
but as you were seeing, you wasn't seeing that, and people don't know that perhaps they probably should take a break when that's declining as well, because people don't know understand, and the practice itself doesn't make you aware because it gives you the artificial adrenaline, the endorphins, and the dopamine. So
You
you
feel
do.
better, which makes it
Yeah,
confusing.
yeah, yeah. Which I call like it's artificial energy, it's state change, and so it can mask things. And so I know, and you'll know as well, is like people who are struggling with fatigue, burnout, they often find coping mechanisms such as high intensity exercise or
Oh
or
yeah.
caffeine or nicotine, ice baths. And that then becomes this unconscious thing that gets them throughout the day, not realizing that if they pull all that away, they would just collapse into a fatigue.
Yeah. Are there cases where you found Wim Hof breathing to be beneficial? Or like when, if someone comes to you, when would you say like, hey, this might be a good method for you to use?
The only way that I really do look at that stuff, to be honest with you, is if you want a state change. Like
Mm,
if you're feeling a bit flat and you have to kind of perform, then perhaps there's an opportunity to use the breath rather than caffeine if you're trying to avoid caffeine, for example, because
sure.
it's impacting sleep. So that's one of the things that I look at. And then obviously you do have the longer forms of that sort of stuff, and then you can kind of there's more and more scientific literature coming around. I guess you could say the more transformational style breath works, where we can start to see people changing and reappraising memories or emotions from the past, it does look like there is some solid concrete evidence coming around, that like, especially with predictive coding and the free energy principle kind of being weaved into neuroscience at the moment. And that if you start then pulling that into that style of breath work, it's like, okay, prediction errors and the brain kind of being forced through surprise at the same time as an unconscious material being released in a safe space, then we have a potential, like it's called perceptual inference, which an update in your perception associated with that. So there are times where I might do that, but it wouldn't be anywhere until someone has built stability and capacity in the physiological systems. And so that's primarily my first role with all of my clients would be to build, first of all, restoring homeostasis or being able to return to homeostasis. Then we build regulation capacity, and then we build resilience capacity, which is widening, you could say, window of tolerance, or you could say just generally your ability to handle metabolic stress, psychological stress, or allostatic load. Now I think someone's in a position to do more intense breath works and get more of a benefit from it, and it for me to be more safe.
Yeah,
Okay, so that's how I see the things. There are some specific, if you look at, there's not a lot of strong literature. There are some areas where it's like, okay, can we see in immune deficiencies, autoimmune deficiencies, there are some evidence suggesting that you might get some benefit from that, but it's only one or two studies. And is that the cold or is that the breath,
mm-hmm.
you know, or is it the belief even? No, the more and more now, I think we're starting to understand. Obviously, we've always understood the placebo effect, but it's is it Lisa Epple? Is it Lisa Epple? Her work in I think it's Stanford, maybe, or one of those universities,
Ooh,
where she's
could be.
writing a book. She's writing a book called Belief.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I always think of
it's
Bruce Lipton's Biology of Belief, which is a little bit
of course,
similar to it, but a little bit different path.
yeah, and so we know that expectation or anticipation of something happening, if we then tie that into a style of breath work where it creates a metacognitive state and a hypnotic state, how much suggestion does an individual onboard, and actually then that creates this belief system that could change, yeah, physiology,
Yeah,
immune
yeah.
system. We know it's connected.
Yeah, and then there's the Wim Hof study in PNAS where they did the was it a endotoxin and then they had them do like the super ventilation method and pretty
Mm,
impressive results. Again,
mm.
that could just be an upregulation of the immune system due to an acute sympathetic stressor too,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, exactly. So I broke down that study not long ago, and I was like, could we do this with high intensity exercise?
Right. Seems
Yeah,
like in
and so
theory you should be able to. I wouldn't want to be in that study.
yeah,
It'd be horrible.
endotoxin, feel sick. Now you got
Yeah,
to go and
yeah.
do
Do
some
wind
sprints.
gates. Come on, go. No, that's cool. That's kind of where similar where I've ended up. Like I only really use the Wim Hof stuff now for maybe one or two rounds to get comparative and buy-in that hey, breathwork
Mm,
does make a difference, and then let's go. So let's go. So I have a concept I just call human dynamic range. Like, can you push the system here, and then can you get it to transition back lower? So could you do
yeah.
one or two rounds of Wim Hof to get a high sympathetic tone, and now can we get as parasympathetic as possible? Can you get as
Hmm.
relaxed as possible? Because now your nervous system has that comparative thing to compare it to. So you can
Yeah.
feel more the difference and kind of feel your way through it.
Yeah. No, I agree that's a component. A lot of people say, and now I feel really relaxed afterwards.
Right.
And it's because you've got a distinguishable difference between those two states, but also you might get some parasympathetic rebound in people who are able to return to
Yes.
baseline. Right. Now, my issue is that how does a person know that actually they are returning to baseline, or are they actually going into a space of dissociation because of reduced blood flow to the prefrontal cortex? It's a
Yes.
question that I ask everybody. And that's, are you aware of the state you're in, and are you actually present with the state you're in? Or are you just kind of in this woo-woo land like, oh, I feel light and funny? And so I think there needs to be a distinguished way that people can explore relaxation and dissociation and understand those two things. Yeah.
Do you find a lot of people their default is to go to a dissociative state?
I think if, especially if there's a history of trauma or
That's what I've noticed.
a poor relationship to affect in general in the system
Mm,
and the body, then they'll go into fantasy in the mind or
mm-hmm,
daydreaming, which is a partial, or you could say a dissociation. The metacognitive state is where it can be good to be in that state. That's the meditative state where you're the
mm-hmm.
observer of what's going on. But there's a fine line between that and then going into daydreaming, which is dissociating from the affective experience, which is not an embodied process.
Yeah. Which again, I think all comes back to you talk about context and what are you trying to do, right? I think you could
Yeah.
make an argument for some types of relaxing meditative states where maybe you are trying to change the default mode network. Maybe you are trying to be a little bit more daydreaming, but the goal is that's the direction you're pushing the system kind of on purpose for a reason, not as a
Yes. Yeah.
reaction to something else.
Yeah. Intentionality is everything
Yes,
in
you're doing it
breathwork.
intentionally.
Absolutely everything. Intention is you could say intention is one of the most important things to live your life by, but specifically when you're trying to create an outcome or using a behavior to shift a sudden state, an intention is very necessary, let's say.
Awesome. So back to your study,
Mm.
do you think respiratory muscle training is beneficial overall? Like if somebody just doesn't have maybe access to, CO2 gas or to anything crazy, they're just doing some type of respiratory muscle training. Do you think it's beneficial that
Yeah.
we could sit here and debate about literature? I could show you tons of literature that have seen the craziest results from just that type of training, and other studies are like, yeah, I didn't do shit.
Yeah. Again, it depends on protocol, obviously, the methodology,
Yes,
how long they've
huge
done it for.
differences.
The amount of resistance really matters as well. And obviously the outcomes that you're trying to measure. But there are so many benefits, particularly with inspiratory muscle training.
Mm,
There's a difference between inspiratory and expiratory. If you're looking for performance benefits, then inspiratory muscle training seems to be better. Expiratory seems to be better for people who got a cough assist and struggle with
okay.
lung disease and stuff like that. And there are some papers, interestingly, if you do both at the same time, you actually see a detriment to performance, and some say you actually see an
Interesting.
improvement. So that's not quite clear in the literature. But inspiratory muscle training has, there's a lot of systematic reviews and meta-analysis around improvements in high intensity exercise, improvements in obviously reducing the respiratory muscle fatigue in longer endurance exercise, repeated sprintability, again, improvements in lactate shuttling. We also have shown in a paper that we published in 2012 reduction in inflammatory markers from ventilation itself. We mimicked
Hmm.
ventilation. We got people to cycle on a bike at 60% max of their VO2 max. We then timed their breathing. We recorded the diaphragmatic pressures and also then used end-tidal carbon dioxide to look at their CO2. Then got them to sit on the bike and match the breathing exactly the same whilst titrating the CO2 to look at what is the inflammatory cost of breathing alone at that.
Mm.
Then did respiratory inspiratory muscle training for 6 weeks, and we significantly reduced, interleukin 6, interleukin 12, like massively. And so
Interesting.
benefits for exercise-induced asthma there, you can probably say, or
Yeah, yeah,
asthma.
for sure.
But blood pressure regulation, improvement in baroreflex sensitivity, sleep apnea. There's also some evidence with
Hmm.
that as well. Improvements in sleep apnea, particularly mild to moderate sleep apnea. Um, and so that, and even if we start to then look at like higher intensity but lower load, so reducing volume but making it more and more intensity, you can see improvements in symptoms in people with chronic fatigue syndrome. What's the other ones? Improvements in HRV following post-exercise. So at 30% of your max for 10 to
Really?
15 minutes following high intensity exercise, you see an increase in HRV.
So you get more parasympathetic tone then.
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah. And so it's like it's bits and pieces all together, but when you can kind of map the picture out, it's like actually, and you understand, then you can start to build protocols that are beyond just typically just building your diaphragmatic strength. And so and obviously there's areas that have strong evidence and and
Sure.
and and more research, and there's areas that are kind of touching the edge of it. But that's what I kind of enjoy with the space I'm in now. Whereas in the medical space beforehand, I was kind of like, you have to wait until it's been put into a protocol or a procedure
Yeah.
that you have to do. Now I'm like, oh, I see 3 or 4 papers that kind of connect some dots. I'm like, see one of my clients and say, hey, try this and see how it helps, and let's measure it. And then you're like, cool, it worked.
Is there an easy, if someone wants to play with this, is there an easy way for them to start the training? And is there any basic assessment to know like this might be a rate limiter, or like they may be really horrible at this, so this may have a higher payoff?
I think if anyone feels if they have ventilatory or breathing limitation during exercise, and so that would obviously just be psychological relationship to believing that they are
Mm-hmm.
not feeling well in their breath when they're exercising, particularly obviously at more high intensities. Because one of the biggest benefits with all breath work in general is perceptual change.
For
And
sure.
so reduce perceived breathlessness at higher intensity exercise, whilst it's not going to increase your VO2 max and potentially massively change your endurance times, it is going to shift how well you believe you've recovered from those sessions. And therefore, like repeated sprintability and repeated high intensity sort of work becomes more tolerable, which then long term could obviously lead to improvements.
For sure.
So that would be, without measuring, that would be one of the things that I would say straight up is, do you believe that your breathing could be improved at higher intensity in exercise? Do you have a poor relationship with you feeling more breathlessness at high intensity exercise? And then you don't need to have advanced devices. As long as you can able to create enough fatigue within 20 to 30 breaths through a device where it feels by the time you get to that 20th, 30th breath. So obviously you get the device in your mouth, nose peg, blowing all the way out, pulling in as hard as you can. If you feel fatigued by the end of that, like 20 to 25 breaths, then that's enough load.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Then maybe 2 weeks later, it starts to feel a bit easier. Turn the load up one. 2 weeks later, easier. Turn the load up one. 6 weeks standard. 30 breaths twice a day is a standard protocol.
Oh, okay. So that's really not a huge amount of time either.
It's not. It's about 5 or 10 minutes twice a day. And then you only need, I believe it's about 3 days a week to
Oh, okay.
maintain.
Oh, that's not bad.
Yeah. It's not, it's not. It's really not. The actual investment for the return, it's significant. And I don't understand why this is not in every single sports team. I don't know why it's not got there yet. Well, I do, it's because most sports teams don't pay attention to breathing, but
Oh, they don't at all, which is so weird. Like, yeah, I'm sure you've seen this too. Like, I've looked at some fair amount of metabolic heart data, and early on, I just looked at all the metabolic things, and like now, one of the first things I look at is what is their simple respiratory rate like during the whole
yeah,
thing, and
yeah.
it's crazy how many people just never look at it. And if you compare that to the volumes and everything else, like now you can get pretty good and be like, hey, you're an endurance athlete. Let me guess. I bet you spent all your time in zone three, barely touching zone
Mm,
four. Oh my God,
mm.
how'd you know that? Because everything outside of that is dog shit. And it's just looking
Yeah,
at the numbers. It's nothing. It's nothing crazy. It's nothing psychic.
respiratory rate is I believe it's one of, if not the most sensitive marker to stress right now.
Yeah,
You
it
know,
is. Yeah, I did a whole presentations on that.
there's
Yeah, especially
so much
overnight respiratory rate.
there's so much research going into it at the moment to try and create better and more accurate ways to measure respiratory rate. I think what we'll see is we'll see earphones that measure the respiratory rate
Ah,
from that. Like if we're thinking portable stuff and easy, simple
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
Obviously,
totally. Yep, yep.
we've got exoskin and we've got stuff you can
Yeah,
wear
yeah.
that's not applicable or feasible for the general audience. So
Yep.
I think we'll start to see Apple like earpods and stuff like that have pick up
Mm,
sound of breath soon.
sure.
But a metabolic car doing a cardiopulmonary exercise test, you see someone's respiratory rate starting to spike up early. For
Yep.
me, there's likely a correlation with HRV there.
Mm,
And so those two things, because it's how early that respiratory rate goes up during exercise is an indicator of how much load the nervous system's it's gone beyond the capacity of the load of that nervous system. And now the
sure.
central command centers of the brain are saying, right, we're under a lot of stress here. We need to drive up respiratory rate.
Got it.
Yeah. respiratory rate is more tied, this is Andrew Nicolo's work at the University of Rome, more tied to non-metabolic stresses than it is metabolic stresses.
Really? Explain that a little
Yeah.
bit.
So obviously we have it's quite interesting because when we look at the literature from, you could say, prior to 2015, everyone's just looked at ventilation and then looked at CO2,
Yep.
right? But then no one's ever really looked at, well, what if we break down ventilation into respiratory rate and volume? And is
Mm,
there any, are these factors independently regulated? And so Mike Tipton, you've probably heard of Mike Tipton,
yep.
environmental physiologist at University of Southampton.
Yeah,
He did
yeah.
a great review paper on stresses in the system, and he found that when you go in the cold, what typically happens, you get cold shock, respiratory rate shoots up, then your body adapts. You then start to produce more metabolic activity, and your volume increases, but your rate comes back down.
Mm,
And so it's like, so this Andrew Nicolo was like, I wonder whether that's a similar in exercise. And so then he did 3 or 4 different studies trying to look at, was there independent variable. And what I actually found was that there's an interdependence and independence, with respiratory rate being a behavioral. And it seems as though that more so non-metabolic factors such as cognition, emotion, perception, cold, heat, stress, anything that's more of a stressor beyond CO2 and pH drives respiratory rate up. Whereas metabolic factors seem to fine-tune your tidal volume.
oh, interesting.
And so chemoreceptors seem to play a backup system, whereas actually we have respiration or breathing's changed via pre-anticipation, predictive
Sure,
systems.
sure. Like a feed forward mechanism.
Feed forward, yeah. So it's respiratory rates feed forward. And so then we say, okay,
Ah,
well that's a learned behavior then. All right. And so now you can put those dots together and go, well, a metabolic stressor can become a non-metabolic stressor. If we have someone who has limited capacity in their tidal volume, and then CO2 starts to hit starts to hit the point where we're not clearing that as effectively, well, the person then experiences a psychological non-metabolic stressor called air hunger, called
mm.
breathlessness. That's an affect. That's an emotional driver. So respiratory rate drives up even further. So
And
this is
that's
where
because, oh, go ahead.
yeah, this is where I actually think the word CO2 tolerance is not quite the right word.
That was exactly my next question. I wrote it down on my
Yeah,
little piece of paper.
yeah. Because I believe that what we're doing is we're having a desensitization to the affective experience, because we see a reduction in respiratory rate with nasal breathing adaptation. We
Yep.
see a reduction in respiratory rate when people are, getting exposed to these sensations. But tidal volume doesn't seem to shift too much. And so obviously this is a hypothesis, but it makes sense from this new literature. But it also makes sense from the experience, anecdotally, from everyone who does this sort of work.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that the CO2 tolerance thing is just bugged the ever living crap out of me for years on end, because you talk to anyone who does a lot of the work and you're like, yeah, I think there's something there. And then you talk to, like, Dempsey in Wisconsin has done tons of this kind of research, and you ask him, you're like, hey, what's CO2 tolerance? He goes, I don't even know what you're talking about. Right. And
Yeah,
this is a
no,
guy who's
yeah,
done hardcore respiratory
yeah,
physiology for decades and decades. And he's like, what are you talking about?
yeah. Well, it was funny because I saw an interview where he got asked by this young gentleman on a podcast, right, about, oh, have you heard of CO2 tolerance? And he was like, no, what is it? And he's
Yeah.
like, well, it was like, you're slightly underbreathe to bring on, an increase in CO2 so you can desensitize your chemoreceptors so that you can feel like you're breathing more easily. And he just went, well, if you're slightly underbreathe, you're going to increase the amount of CO2 that's in the alveoli. So you're also going to reduce the oxygen gradient in the alveoli and slow down the amount of oxygen that can come through the alveoli into the blood. So
Correct.
it's like, it doesn't make sense to do that. So yeah, he just on this podcast, he goes, it sounds silly to me. But so I generally don't think, and the consensus has been obviously, improve the Bohr effect, improve oxygen delivery
Sure.
by increasing CO2. But then there's no paper that has shown any improvement in VO2 max.
That's
George
what's
Dallam
so that's what's so
has,
weird too. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. George Dallam has produced probably the only paper where someone's gone through a significant period of nasal adaptation
Hmm.
and then done a CO2, a metabolic cart before and after whilst they're doing nasal breathing and mouth breathing. And the VO2 max was the same statistically. Yeah. You could say observably it was less in nasal breathing, but there was a moderate effect size with that. So then you're like, well, statistically it's not different, but practically it could be.
Sure.
It could reduce it if there's a moderate effect size, even if it's not statistically, but observably less in VO2 max. So what I think really is happening is you're just getting a reduction in potential gas exchange, but then the Bohr effect is having to compensate for that by extracting more O2 out at the level of the hemoglobin, but it's not actually creating an advantage or an increase. It's just creating an adaptation.
Yeah.
It's just found stability again. It's able to find stability again. But the benefit is reduced respiratory rate.
Yes.
And so then if the benefits reduce respiratory rate, well, if we then go back to the concept of non-metabolic stressors, what does that do?
Yep.
Well, potentially it feeds back up to the brain to then say we're more calm.
Yep.
So I think it's all affective and perceptual.
Yeah. So in that study, when they did the VO2 max test, was one group restricted only to nasal breathing during the test, or they could just breathe however they wanted?
No, so it was the same group, and they did 6 months of training, and they did they did nasal only or mouth over pre and post.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
what do you call that, crossover?
Yeah, yeah. So they did both conditions. I was just trying to get at if, because I've seen some metabolic heart data where you're looking at it and you're like, what? This doesn't make sense. Like your volumes of air at max are just all goofy. It took me a while to figure it out. And I said, what kind of breathing technique were you using? This? Oh, I was still doing nasal in, nasal out. I'm like,
Mm,
at the end of the test, during a max test, they're like, well, I was told that's better. And I'm thinking, well, you don't want to limit air exchange on a
mm,
max test at
mm.
the end because that's obviously going to compromise your performance. So that's the reason why I was asking that.
Yeah, well, another thing that people don't consider is that you might get a better extraction of oxygen because of the Bohr effect, but also if
Right.
you're not getting better clear out of CO2, you're going to have a
Correct.
shift and
Yes.
change in pH down at the level of the cell, and the
Yes.
cell itself, the mitochondria are going to start to be able to, the actual
Screw you,
ability
buddy.
to be able to, yeah. So whilst you might get better oxygen delivery, oxygen like utilization might be compromised because if you've got an increase in acidity.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is where the complexity of all this together, as we mentioned at the very beginning, the conversation that we had maybe even before this, it's like people just look at one component of the breathing and go, "Oh, it's biological plausibility there that can happen," but not understanding the sequence of events that occurs when you change the breath.
Hmm.
It changes everything. And evolution has designed or evolved this way to make it so that our breathing is matched perfectly to metabolism because we die if we don't. So
Yeah.
we best not play around with it too much long term. Yeah, maybe we stress it for a period like we would with any stressor to build adaptation, but let's not just say that everyone should breathe through the nose all the time at any intensity because that is just not. Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree. That's why I went so far down this rabbit hole. I bought a whole friggin' metabolic cart and a 3-Moxy setup because I'm like, well, if I can put sensors on the main working muscles to see SMO2 to see if the Bohr
Mm.
effect is really still there, but now I have all the physiologic markers of respiratory rate, CO2, O2 to try to, figure out like what's going
Mm.
on. And I don't know, I probably need to do a lot more testing, but I'm also
Well,
convinced
I
now that
imagine as soon as you get above VT2 with nasal breathing, you're just going to see a SMO2 just tank.
correct. You see these big changes that a lot of athletes weren't aware of. And that's
Mm.
what I found was the most useful for that test. But to try to get down to what is their absolute rate limiter in those kind of edge cases where most things look good, I'm not even convinced the athlete will use the exact same strategy from one test to the next because of allostatic load, other things that's going on, their perception.
100%.
I
100%.
haven't seen it be as reproducible as I want, and it drives me nuts.
Yeah, this is also an issue I have with metabolic card testing. if we now know that affect makes a big difference to respiratory rate,
Yep,
and we're not also measuring, you could say as a proxy for someone's ability to embody affect or to have capacity. If we're not measuring HRV, trait HRV, whilst they're also doing
sure.
that test, well, that could change the outcome of respiratory rate, and
Oh,
that
for
could
sure,
change the
yeah,
outcome
because you're
of
putting them
everything.
under a
So
stressor. You throw this mask on, breathe through what feels like Darth Vader.
yeah, yeah. Even if you've done 48 hours of like, we're gonna standardize a protocol where it's like 48 hours beforehand, you don't have any recovery, like, any
Correct.
intense stressors. But that's not like in terms of exercise, that doesn't mean they haven't had massive arguments with their partner or they're going through depression or yeah, obviously you can do that with scales and you can measure that sort of stuff. But there's so many factors there that I do think that if we're starting to look at breathing as a behavior that is associated with allostatic load, then we need to consider that within the system and we need to be able to monitor that as well through questionnaires or measurements of HRV. Because we know that there is a correlation between VT1 and HRV, for example.
Oh, for sure, yeah, yeah. So so my latest hypothesis, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, as we're getting close to the end, I'm not as convinced that nasal breathing changes CO2 tolerance as much as I used to be. However, I have found overnight respiratory rate, if it's very high, I think is a background stressor that is an unconscious thing. So if I see someone's aura and there is 17 breaths per minute, I feel
Mm,
pretty confident, and I've done this with multiple athletes, gotten them to 13, 14, 12. In almost every case, their HRV goes up, they're more resilient, they can handle more stressors. So my new hypothesis is I don't know how much of effect it is on CO2 tolerance because I haven't noticed concomitant massive increases in performance, especially max
mm,
performance. But
mm,
I have noticed that everyone has reported they feel better, they feel calmer, we can push more load, their HRV is better, their resting heart rate is better. Like all those other things do seem to improve.
mm. Yeah, and so that's, for me, it's that, yeah, it's the adaptations at the level of the nervous system. Yeah,
Right.
within the way that I believe the mechanism is from I guess the hypothesis that I'm putting together with the literature that I've read is it's like, you know, CO2 tolerance would be desensitization of the chemoreceptors.
Correct.
All right. Now we might see that in long-term freedivers who
Oh,
practice
for
this
yeah,
stuff
those are
all the
crazy
time.
people.
Yeah. But having someone to practice nasal breathing and doing some gentle breath holds, what I actually believe that is that, chemoreceptors send information up to the brainstem, then that information is relayed into, the salient parts of the brain, insula, ACC, and obviously that then goes into the amygdala, which then creates the sensation of air hunger. That's what we know the mechanism of air hunger is in general. But then if we're getting exposure in a way that's safe, where people can tolerate it, they're not going beyond capacity that leads to anxiety and panic, the frontal cortex can improve cortical modulation of those two areas of the brain. And so we get desensitization occurring there, which then is a state dependent change. So does that then cross into, well, someone's just got better regulation of their amygdala and insula, so they're better emotionally regulated. And so you could call that nervous system regulation, right? And so I just think that CO2 tolerance was really just nervous system regulation.
Yeah, it's almost
And
like would it oversimplification be it's sort of almost like a learned skill?
yes, it is. Yeah, it's a conditioning.
Yeah,
Or
conditioned effect. Yeah.
decoupling of effect. And that's why the beauty of it is that if you do have people who have panic and anxiety, you can start to use it as an exposure. The
Mm-hmm.
same mechanism will be as the ice bath for resilience,
Yep.
but you're just using a cold as a stressor. Well, we're using air hunger as a stressor in CO2 tolerance work.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of matches what I was thinking too. Last question, we can talk to you for hours on end and we'll have you plug all your stuff here at the end for sure. And this might be another podcast in and of itself, but do you think CO2 as an inhaled gas is useful? I'm actually talking to a company here that has a full body CO2 thing where I guess CO2 can be absorbed transdermally through the skin.
Yeah.
Um, because I've looked at inhaling CO2 as a gas is expensive. There's some other issues with it. There's some very interesting early literature, but I don't know, just I guess general thoughts on that, which again, this could be a whole nother hour
Yeah, of
discussion
course.
about it.
Yeah. So anecdotally, I haven't experienced large doses of CO2 myself or wore a CO2 suit, but I know people who have and who do it regularly, and they do feel as if they feel more relaxed after. So
Hmm.
that aligns with what we've just talked about. It's
Yes,
likely some form of that mechanism. There probably is some form of vasodilation, and an improvement in oxygen flow in a suit
sure.
that could have no particular benefits for reducing inflammation and reacting to oxygen species if it's the right dose. If we do too much, then
Yep.
obviously it's going to be costly as well there. That's my issue with it, is that we're playing with things that nature didn't intend us to do, and therefore we have to be mindful of dose, like very, very mindful of dose. So that's like anecdotal and I guess you could say more speculation or hypothesis. Whereas there is a review paper that came out, I believe, in December, where they've actually looked at what's the evidence for inhalation of CO2 and the benefits of
Oh,
CO2.
interesting. I haven't seen that one.
I'll send you the paper.
Yeah, 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 for
I
sure.
haven't got all the way through it yet, but as you do when you first read it, abstract and scan read
Yeah,
it
yeah.
before you dive into it. The conclusion was there's just not enough evidence
Hmm.
to show a benefit yet, but there's enough evidence to say that there are detriments to do this. And at the moment, we're concluding that this is more dangerous. There's more risk than there is benefit. But that's not to say that that's just because there's not enough evidence.
Yeah, I've
That
just seen a couple crazy posts from some biohackers who I'm like, I don't think you understand anything about O2 CO2 regulation and recommending it as an inhaled gas as a therapy without some high level constraints and other thing. I that makes
mm,
me nervous.
yeah.
Again, transdermal, I don't know. I don't know enough about that delivery mechanism, but
Mm,
exactly to your point, we know that high dose CO2 can cause anxiety, people to freak out. That's just the way our physiology
yeah.
is wired.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, CO2 and pH is not the it's a state encoder. That's what it is.
Mm,
So whatever's happening consciously in the experience of the individual gets conditioned and encoded into that state. And so, we have acid sensing ion channels in our hippocampus, our amygdala, peripheral nervous system, and so that when acid reduces, those channels open up. And we do know from mice literature and some human studies that that has been associated with conditioning fear and pain,
yep.
suffering. And so there's a lot of research around, okay, particularly in mice, where they're starting to demonstrate if we actually genetically engineer mice to not have these, it's hard to give a mouse PTSD.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's hard to
Yeah.
get them to condition to the electric shock when they go to get feed, for example.
Hmm.
And so it looks like there is a plausible mechanism there that could be associated with, well, here we have a state encoder that encodes fear states.
Yep.
And we know that also, obviously, James Nestor did write about this in the book
Yeah, yeah,
with
totally.
and Justin Feinstein's work as well
Yep.
around apnea-driven anxiety. He's delved into this and touched into this. But I think that if you're in a safe setting where you feel as if you're okay, we could shift that relationship because there'll be an update in perception. But if you're in, for example, a panic attack and you're in an environment where actually there is something happening and there's a stress that causes a conscious state of anxiety, well, that's the state that gets encoded. So
Yeah.
that's
So it's
the
like,
way that I see PH.
yeah, it's almost like, but I think of state specific alerting, or even you could go down the path of like stress inoculation, right? Can
Yeah,
you
yeah,
slowly use stress model, expose yourself to it, make sure your state is
yeah.
solid. If that's
Hmm.
good, you can probably, scale up a little bit. If you kind of
Mm,
cross a threshold or someone had a bad experience before or whatever,
mm, mm,
now you're just, I think of this as the same way, like if people are doing like CBT therapy, like the reason MDMA therapy for PTSD probably works so well is that you quiet some of those centers in the amygdala. You don't have as much fear response. You're not recoding that experience all the time,
mm,
getting the sweaty palms, getting the same sensation. You're now changing that to I can talk about the experience, I can go
mm,
through it, but I don't
mm,
have all these negative affects maybe coming in at the
mm,
same time that I'm
mhm.
I'm digging the trench deeper and deeper. I'm actually rewiring the trench to go somewhere
Yeah,
else now.
yeah. Updating your perception. Yeah, for
Correct.
sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's an analogy that I like to give. It's like, remember the old tape recorders where you used to have to press play and record
Yes.
at the time. It's like imagine that's what when your body starts to deviate, whether that is high CO2, low CO2, or with excess production of lactate,
Sure.
press and pause and play gets pressed, and then whatever happens in the conscious experience gets recorded. And
Mm,
if that is significant enough, it might be imprinted in the moment, or if it's repetitive, it might then get embedded as a memory. And then that's what gets recalled into perception when that state
yes.
is recalled. So when we go into those states, then that's what we record. You know, I had a lady that I was working with who lost her grandfather, and then as a way to try and cope with it, she started doing more hard training. And then all of a sudden, she was
Mm,
finding that whenever she did hard training, she was actually grieving all the time. She couldn't stop crying when she was doing a high intensity work. And I
yep.
was like, to me, that's like a state dependent learning that's occurred there. The
Yep.
affective experience has been encoded, likely through digressing into MCT channels, memory, and all that sort of stuff. Similar sort of concept.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Super cool. Awesome stuff.
Mm.
Please tell us where we can find lots more about you.
Yeah, so you can find me on social media, Martin McPhilimey, or just follow the School of Breath Science is my main educational company around where I'm educating people in this area and doing professional qualifications and training.
Awesome. And I know you got courses there. You got a ton of free stuff. You got a bunch of stuff.
Mm.
Tell us your Instagram also, so we have that.
Yeah, so the Instagram is just Martin
Oh, the
McPhilimey.
same name. Oh, okay, great.
Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This was super cool. I could talk to you for hours, and thank you so much for answering all my crazy questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. A huge thanks to Martin for coming on the podcast and answering all my crazy questions related to breathing and breath regulation and everything else. Make sure to check out all the great stuff. He's got really good free stuff on Instagram. He's got paid courses and a lot of just really, really good stuff. Like I said in the intro, I think there's a lot of people who do breath work that are really good on the practice side of, hey, do this. But as we talked about in the podcast, I haven't found a lot of people who have done a deep dive into the academic side and the regulation, and then also how you translate that into performance and changing your state so that you're doing the correct technique and you're doing it also for the right reason. Because the context and everything here is going to be super important. I've had some clients early on do breath work that unfortunately made them worse, which was my error because I kind of thought, oh, all breath work will be helpful for everyone, and that is definitely not true. So check out all the great stuff he's got on his Instagram and everywhere else. And then if you want more information from me, the PhysFlex cert is still open through this coming Monday, midnight Pacific Standard Time, April 27th, 2026. And in Pillar 4, we talk a lot about oxygen and CO2 regulation, basically breathing, and then how you can take that information and make it practical. So big thanks to Martin for coming on the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you have a little bit of time to give us a like, download, subscribe, or even leave us a review, stars, all the great things for all the algorithms, that's super, super helpful. And if you have someone who would be interested in this, please forward it on to them or share it online. Make sure to tag me so I can say thank you for that. So thank you so much for listening to the podcast. We really appreciate it. Stay tuned, and we'll have much more coming up for you very soon. See ya.
You are my sunshine, my only sunshine.
Why, you old fool!
What?
I'm not your son, and my name's not Shine.
He calls me an old fool.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.